Cool. We are recording now. So, hello, I'm Adam Kelnhofer with WisPolitics.com, here with a feature for DC Wrap. I'm joined by political science professor Mordecai Lee at UWM. He is also a former legislative assistant for a Dem congressman and a former state legislator. We're going to be talking about the current division in the grand old party between Trump supporters and people who are opposed to former Trump policies. So, Mr. Lee, Mr.
Mordecai.
Mordecai, can you tell us a little bit more about that divide and what those divisions are, what the two sides are?
I think it's really hard to see in Wisconsin, and that's a consequence of the fact that we have a kind of district lines that are so one-party tilted. In other words, we've got Republican members of Congress who know how to win a Republican primary. And then they don't sort of know how to win a general election because they're in a Republican district. And so we're seeing members of Congress who are quickly identifying with whatever is sort of the prevalent opinion. And right now it's the base, it's the Trump base. And so they know they need to feed the Trump base. No, the only minor exception for a very brief time was Congressman Gallagher from Green Bay, who had a kind of a famous quote about this sort of looks like a tin pot dictatorship, or that's not quite the quote. But he quickly sort of shifted and got back on board. And I think that's because, generally speaking, politicians have a fingertip feel for politics and for public opinion and for their voters. And it doesn't take very many emails or phone calls for them to know that the Republican base, the people they need to win a primary, are still Trump supporters, and therefore they are Trump supporters. Now, politicians can have very short memories. Right now, the Republican base is still very much pro-Trump, and that's the politics that somebody needs. So hypothetically, let's say Scott Fitzgerald is running for re-election, and let's say hypothetically that there's some kind of a moderate Republican who's running against him, more of a sort of standard Tommy Thompson kind of conservative. So does Scott Fitzgerald run TV ads for the primary saying, I stood with President Trump, I opposed the certification of the results? In other words, is he proud of it? Does he think that'll help him win the primary? Or will public opinion have shifted so much in a way that it's hard for us to conceive that he'll be sort of hiding that vote, and his opponent would be running TV ads saying, Congressman Fitzgerald stood with President Trump after the riot and blah, blah, blah. And therefore, you should not vote to reelect him. You should vote for me so I win the primary and then get elected. That's how touchy the politics might be. Public opinion can turn around on a dime, but I think the zealous supporters of President Trump are not going to fade away. What it sort of really comes down to, it seems to me, is, I guess you'd say, sort of demography. That right now there are two silos in the Republican Party, although they're sort of hard to see. There's the blue-collar rural silo, and those are the Trump supporters. And then there are the suburban, college-educated, above-average income, one-income families who live in Waukesha County, what we used to call sort of country club Republicans. It's not a very good term anymore, but it's people who didn't particularly like Trump, and the women of the family just generally voted against Trump, but the men of the family sort of stuck with Trump, not because they liked him, but because they agreed with cutting taxes and pro-business and cutting regulations. But I think with him off the scene, the sort of suburban silo of the party is going to get stronger. I don't think we're necessarily going to see that in the primary next year, but I think it's going to become more and more distinctive.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you mentioned that it comes more down to demographics within the state. I want to bring up Senator Ron Johnson because he's coming up for re-election in 2022, and his district is pretty large, as senatorial districts are. Do you think he's been a pretty staunch Trump ally so far, and I don't see anything of that just dropping off or him stopping supporting anytime soon? Do you think that's going to be an advantage or a disadvantage for him in 2022?
Adam, I think that's the perfect example, which is sort of the opposite of what we just talked about in terms of Republican primaries in one-party districts. That Wisconsin is a two-party district, if you can use that term. Wisconsin in a statewide race can be just as easily won by a Republican as it can be won by a Democrat. We only have to look at the last couple of general elections in Wisconsin and realize that Wisconsin is not a predictable state. So if you're Ron Johnson, you don't need to worry about a primary. You're the incumbent. Who's really going to run against you? But do you win the general election by standing for Trump in the way he has been in, let's say, the last sort of month or so? Or do you start feeling the reality of the politics, and that's that if you stand with Trump and you use that as the reason that you should be reelected, that might be a loser of a proposition in terms of TV advertising. And in fact, that your Democratic opponent might use that against you to try to win the election. Now, again, we don't know where public opinion will be. We certainly don't know what the turnout will be, who will be mobilized for a general election. But it's not the same logic for Ron Johnson about standing with the Trump base as it is for the members of Congress to stand with Trump.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Have we ever seen, a lot of Republicans, I think, are worried, and Democrats are maybe a little bit excited about this division among Republicans. They, maybe a little bit of the divide and conquer tactic. But have we ever seen any kind of a divide within a political party in Wisconsin like this before?
Well, divides within parties are sort of common to politics. You can go back to 1968 on the Democratic side. There was the anti-war faction, the war in Vietnam, and there was the tepidly pro-war faction that supported Lyndon Johnson's reelection. Then, of course, he dropped out of the Wisconsin presidential primary in '68 just in time to not have to face the voters. But since then, I mean, you've got the Goldwater Party of the Republican Party in 1964 versus the Rockefeller moderates. You've got the presidential election from 4 years ago when there was the Trump silo and there was the anti-Trump silo. In fact, I think some people forget that when Scott Walker dropped out of the race for president 5 years ago, he said that one of the reasons he was dropping out was that he wanted conservatives to be able to rally around one conservative candidate. And the other half of that sentence that remained unspoken was so that Trump does not become the nominee. Now, we all know that Scott Walker dropped out of the race for president for several reasons. It wasn't just sort of purely altruistic. But the fact that the standard conservatives, Tommy Thompson conservatives, did not see Trump as one of their own, and that they wanted someone of their own, for example, a kind of a George W. Bush kind of candidate, to be the nominee 5 years ago was an indication of what the politics were at the time and how quickly it changed. And I guess we'd say that the reason it changed is, yes, Trump won enough primaries so that he became the nominee. But in most of those primaries, it was not one-on-one. It was not that sort of model race that Scott Walker wanted to see of one conservative versus Trump. In most of the races that Trump won leading up to getting the nomination were multi-candidate races. And in fact, if I'm remembering right, Trump lost the Wisconsin presidential primary, that he was not all that popular. But what I suppose the most important ingredient that we forget about is Trump's general success had been with people who had not been politically mobilized before him. You know, we talk about the blue collar, rural Wisconsin male, high school graduate who was sort of tepidly a voter and maybe tepidly a Republican voter. And then Trump just electrified them. And that's what changed the Republican Party. Now, I'm just not sure if they have the staying power politically that, say, the Tea Party had. We don't talk much about the Tea Party nowadays, but the Tea Party for a while looked like it was going to be a silo of the Republican Party. And then Republicans, I think, shrewdly sort of opened their arms and said, welcome, we will be the Tea Party for you. So those are some examples of when we've seen intra-party kind of controversies. But the big historical change that we have to remember is that Ronald Reagan used to talk about a big tent Republican Party. The Franklin Roosevelt Democratic Coalition had these contradictory elements of Southern racists and urban African Americans who were polar opposites and political enemies. But he managed to keep them inside the tent. Now we're living in an era where both parties have become narrow tent parties, much more homogeneous ideologically. The Republican Party is the right of center party, the conservative party. The Democratic Party is the left of center party. If it's Joe Biden for the long run, it's the moderate left of center. If it becomes somebody else, it might be the farther left of center. But these are homogeneous parties, and therefore the silos are no longer ideologically driven.
Do you think, so we've seen quite a few Wisconsin Republican congressmen endorse Trump to a pretty high standard. I think U.S. Representative Glenn Grothman from Glenview was ranked as the most loyal Trump supporter. Do you think we're going to see any of those congressmen walk back from the support for Trump?
You know, John F. Kennedy wrote a book, or had a book ghost written for him before he ran for president, called Profiles in Courage. And the theme of that book is politicians who put their career on the line for an idea, for a position. And I guess the reason the book was successful and why it's somewhat remembered is because you don't see profiles in courage very often in politics. Politicians are not famous for falling on their swords. Politicians are in the business of getting reelected or getting elected to higher office. And right now, the way politics looks to members of Congress from Wisconsin who are Republicans is that you stick with Trump because that's the winning position. It won't necessarily be in about 15 months, but at least it is right now. And I suppose the metric to watch is going to be, do we start seeing the cracks in the wall? Do we start hearing the yes, but? I don't think we're gonna, because they feel that to win their primary and therefore get reelected in a one-party district, staying with Trump is very safe.
All right. Well, thank you very much for talking about Republicans in Congress with me today, Mordecai. It was a pleasure to have you on DC Rap today, and I hope to see you soon again, maybe, hopefully, maybe in person, actually. I don't know. Anything could happen. We don't know.
My God, two people in the same room at the same time? Wow. Thank you, Adam. A pleasure to visit with you.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.
You too.
All right. Perfect. Thank you.